everybody, Invisiblekatana here, and today I would like to discuss whether or not QTEs still have a place in gaming. Now, of course, QTEs had their moment in time where it was like, everybody hated them because QTEs were everywhere. But they still live. Like, they still live on even today. There are still games that come out with them. Most recently, I think, I can't even remember. It was either Spider-Man 2 or Resident Evil 4. I'm not sure which one is actually most recent out of those two games, but both of those have them. RE4, of course, back in the day, that's when we were still in the QTE era. Although I'd say it was kind of rare. That was before it got crazy. I would say in the PS2 era is when it was like, okay, some games have it. Technically God of War has QTEs, and that was just a part of the action, and it works there. I think it still fits, even if you go back to playing the old games. I think it still fits with that style of gameplay. RE4 had it where you run from the boulder, or during the actual cutscenes, they had like QTE moments and stuff, and that was always tricky, especially if your disc was messed up. You may or may not die from that, because I had the scene with Krauser, and there's a moment where you're supposed to deflect the knife and do a nice little parry, and because the game would freeze, the buttons will pop up, but it's like, oh, this isn't really a cutscene, it's like a combination of things that have to load, and the game would freeze, and I'm like, I hit the buttons, what's gonna happen here? And then I got stabbed a bunch until the game finally worked itself out, and then I was able to keep playing the game. But QTEs definitely have a storied history, amongst gaming, where it's like, hey, like I said, by the way, if you don't know this, the original iteration of QuickTime events, which also that's what QTE stands for if you didn't know that, QuickTime events, QTEs were made for the very first Shenmue. Shenmue was the first game to ever make QTEs in a video game. And as things have gone on, like I said, during that era, Dreamcast, PS2, I guess technically Xbox, but I didn't have any games that had QTEs on the original Xbox, but by the time we hit the 360 era and then the PS3 era, that's when QTEs were like rampant in the streets. It was like crack. It was like the crack epidemic. It was like they were all over that place. People were tired of QTE segments just taking over, where it's like, can I just do this thing? Can I have this moment where I just played this, or it's just a cutscene? And I think that was a big part of where a lot of things came from, where it's like, why couldn't this have just been a cutscene? Like, honestly, most games that did it could have just been cutscenes. There are a couple where I'm like, you know what? This kind of works. Oddly enough, the example I'm about to give, they continue that trend, and I still think they do it well today. But it's Asura's Wrath. They had a bunch of QTE segments. That whole game was like full of QTEs, where it's like you hit the button to like go crazy, and you hit the button to like do all the punches and things like that. And that's CyberConnect. And for anyone who has no idea why that's important, CyberConnect does the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm games, and they also did like the Demon Slayer game and stuff. I don't know, as far as the Demon Slayer game, what they do for QTEs. I'm sure they're in there somewhere. But for Naruto, if you're playing the story side of the gameplay, not necessarily just like, if you just do random battle mode, but if you're doing the actual story, they have tons of QTEs in there, and you get like bonus points for doing it within a certain amount of time and stuff. But that game has QTEs all over the place, and I feel like it works for those games because it's so high-paced action, where it's like, going back to classic RE4, there's no need for me to be doing like 2 button presses during a full effing cutscene. Like, it was when you look back on it, it's like, there was no need for this. This literally could have been a cutscene, and they just made it like, just hit some buttons and maybe you live, maybe you die. But realistically, that was pointless. When they have the scenes where you're running from a boulder, it's like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna button press this because this is in game. I'm actually doing this. A boulder's coming after me like Indiana Jones. I have to run. So I got a button mash, and then I have to hit the button to dodge out of the way. It's still in gameplay. And it's just like, okay, yeah, it's like a setup sequence, but it's still there. It's still in gameplay, and it makes a lot more sense. They have the Del Lago boss fight, which is the one where you fight the creature in the water. You get knocked out of the boat, which I really hate that they took that out of the remake. That was actually one of my favorite elements. Like, oh, if you crash the boat, you fall out and you have to swim. I actually like that element of the QTE. Like, oh man, I got a button mash, and you got to make sure you get back to the boat on time. It's a QTE segment, but it's a cool way to do that, where it's like, it's in gameplay. You're still controlling how fast or how slow you swim, and you better hit that button fast so Leon swims a little faster back to that boat. And like those elements, I'm like, yeah, that totally works. When it comes to Asura's Wrath, it's a part, and of course, you could definitely just do full cutscenes. Obviously, if they did that, there would be a lot less of the game that you're interacting with, because there's so many Like, it's weird. Like, I think when the action is so bombastic, it works, even if it's more cutscene based. And so it's just one of those levels. Like, you can either do it, if it's in gameplay, it works 100% of the time. If it's in a cutscene, it has to be over the top, but somehow balanced out. Like, it can't be so much where it's like, this is boring. Like, I got to do a cut. Honestly, this is actually a perfect example. I would say, and don't hate me on this, but I would say Heavy Rain's a good example of, like, you have to do a QTE for like every stupid little thing you do. Oh, I got to pick up this paper. Oh, you failed to pick up the paper. Oh, I got a paper cut this time. Like, stuff like that. It was innovative. So once again, that was like QTE the game. So for that specific game, it works. But there are a buttload of games out there, and I think a lot of people, I'm sure, if you have examples of this, please put it below. But there are a buttload of games that are not either Heavy Rain or Asura's Wrath, where it's like, it's kind of QTE the game, but they actually make it work because that's what it's meant to be. And yet somehow it still feels like QTE the game, but it's like, this is enough an action adventure game. Why am I doing so many QTEs during cutscenes for the most mundane things? Like, it has to either be really over the top or it has to be in gameplay. It can't just be, okay, well, you want to pick up the sheet of paper, boom, QTE thing. Or like, oh, I got to block this one thing in like a 3-minute cutscene. Like, I didn't remember that was there. Like, stuff like that, where it's like, there was no need for them to put that in there. It could have just been an actual cutscene. And I think that was when the era of it just being like absolutely insane was happening. And people were just doing it where it's like, there's just no reason for that. Like I said, Asura's Wrath and Heavy Rain are like really great examples of, with Heavy Rain being the simpler side because it was real life. And even then people made jokes about it, like, what if you just don't push the buttons? But once again, that was a part of the experience. Every single thing was like, oh, you gotta be like, oh, you gotta be on your P's and Q's. That was a part of the entire experience, was the QTE element of that game. And then Asura's Wrath was so insanely over the top that they were like, okay, well, we're not gonna have you just watch an action cutscene, we're gonna have you be involved. And I think it works. It reminds me a bit of like Bayonetta, where they have moments where characters clash, or you just do like the button press it's really more for points in that than it is anything else. But when the action is so hyperbolic, when you're button mashing, it just feels like it works. Metal Gear Solid is a great example of the torture sequence. You have to button mash, and it's like, hey, it's one of those important moments in the game. Like, if you didn't save, it's a whole game over situation. But in that moment, it's like, all right, you got to button mash to survive. That's probably where my skills really came from, was the Metal Gear Solid sequence. But in that moment, that makes sense. It's like a frantic moment, like, oh man, I got to survive. I feel like that is very similar to trying to make sure Leon swims fast enough in the RE4 boss fight, where it's like, you have to do this to survive or you're going to actually die. And it's not, oh, you died in the middle of a cutscene where you're watching. And I'm sure there are tons of people, like, I don't remember the first time I ever came across the RE4 cutscene with Krauser where they're fighting, because when you first watch that, I don't know when the first QTE segment pops up, but it's a straight up cutscene. You have no idea. It's just a cutscene, and then it's just like, holy crap, I have to hit buttons in this? And I'm pretty sure that's like the only time it happens in the entire game where, no, it's not the only time, but I do believe it's the first time it happens. And I could also be wrong about that as far as like in an actual cutscene where you have to hit a button. But I think it was during the Krauser fight, because I know the other time it happens is when Leon gets dropped down into the pit, and you have to like basically use his little, it's not a zip line, but the little grapple hook that he has, and you have to hit the button as he's falling in order to actually save his life, and then obviously keep playing the game. But with the Krauser thing, I'm sure there are tons of people that died from that, or maybe people that went back and it's like, I didn't remember that was in there. Like, you play the game 10 years later and it's like, dang, I forgot that this was like one of the 2 cutscenes that has a QTE segment. And they really didn't need it. It was like, all it was for this instantaneous moment where he deflects a knife. And obviously if you don't do it, you will get stabbed and then you have to redo it. And it's like, there was no need for that. That didn't, it was cool back then. But when I look at it now, it's like, that didn't really add anything. Like I said, the one during the boss fight, that makes sense. You have to swim faster. When the boulders are coming after you, you have to run faster, so make sure you button mash. And then I always hated the fact that you never knew what buttons came up at the end because they switched it on you. And it was like, and now push these 2 different buttons to dodge. And it was like, you better hope you can do it in time, otherwise you're screwed. But for those moments in game, I definitely think it fit. And then the cutscene thing, very rare for Resident Evil, so it wasn't something that was like the most annoying thing in the universe. And I can't even remember any in cutscene for like RE5, but I know they had like QTE segments in that too, specifically the Geo boss fight where you have to like fight the enemies and stuff. And even those, I think as the evolution kind of went along, even to this point, beyond the era of when it was just way too much, we still have QTEs. Like I said, RE4 still has them. Spider-Man has them. I doubt that they'll just magically take them out. They have them just like during those special moments where it's like, okay, we just want you to hit here and here. You move the thumbsticks and then press L1 and R1 or something like that. So I think they're gonna stay. But I think the evolution of QTEs almost changed them, because it used to be like, hey, it has to be a quick time event, but there's so many now, and I think Spider-Man's actually a great example. You can take all the time in the world and they just slow it down, and it's like, we just want you to push these 2 buttons, because we couldn't have you really do this perfectly during gameplay, where you have to 100% accurately hit this thing over here and this thing over here, and especially that could be from, you know, the camera angle to what's happening in the scene. It makes sense that they have some of those moments, but they slow them down, so it's like, technically it's not really a quick time event, it's more of just a, you know, a button press event, you know. But obviously QTE is the name that we have for them. But I feel like we've gotten to a point, and this isn't across the board, because RE4, the remake, I still say they're straight up QTEs. When you do the deflection, that's a QTE. Even though you're technically like doing a parry, that is a QTE. Like, the button still pops up. It's not like, you know, you just do it. I mean, obviously you can, if you know, you get your timing down, you don't have to have it there, but the button will pop up. It'll say L1 and it's like, now you can do your parry. Like, it's literally a QTE segment where it's telling you this is your window to press this button, and it's straight up a classic QTE moment, and it's there every time. Something's flying at you that you can hit. Like, the amount of times I've seen L1 pop up and I didn't press it in time is like, oh, that's interesting. Like, it's still there. Like, it's about as classic as a QTE segment can possibly be. So they still exist in their classic form. And then, you know, there's modes like Spider-Man, or moments I should say, like Spider-Man, where it's much slower, where like it has the feel of a QTE, but technically they just put it in slow motion, and it's like, well, we just had to curate this specific moment, but we still want you to interact with the game. So it's an interesting shift as to, of course, how it's been when it was going absolutely insane and everything was a QTE. And then, like I said, you know, you have games like Heavy Rain and Asura's Wrath. I feel like both of those apply as like almost QTE the game. Like, especially Heavy Rain literally is that. And then Asura's Wrath just has a buttload of QTE segments. But the things that happen in that game are so insane that that's why it works. Like, it almost has to be crazy and over the top. And just as it continues that tradition, or at least Cyber Connect continued that tradition once they started doing the Ultimate Ninja Storm games, you play the story mode, and there's stuff happening in the anime where it's like, well, how are you gonna have a giant toad slide down a vine with a blade come out and then jump 30 feet in the air and then stab down? Like, how do you do that in gameplay? Like, this ain't Tony Hawk. You're not gonna have a giant frog grinding on this thing, press the button at the end, and then do all that in motion. It's like, we're just gonna curate this. We want you to hit a couple buttons and just do it a cool way. And I think even in those, if you don't press them in time, you can fail, and it just resets the thing. It's like, all right, you failed. Here you go. And then they just jump back like 10 seconds, and it's like, all right, you know, do it right this time. And that's about it. But they have these moments where it's like, this makes sense. And of course, it could just be a straight up cutscene, but they find that balance. Like, there's a balance to have QTE segments that are strictly video based and not like, you know, in the RE4 remake, when you're parrying, that's all in game, you know, once again. And you can do all sorts of things to avoid even having to parry if you take out enemies fast enough. But it's all in game if you have to. Still a QTE segment. Like I said, the button literally pops up. It's not in the middle of the screen. It's like, you know, in a tiny little spot on the side. But it still pops up. It's a QTE segment. And then you have the Naruto games where it's like you're going through this insane story mode, and it could easily just be a cutscene. But something about just hitting it, like all you do is hit a couple buttons. And if you don't, you fail. But something about that when you're going through it, and it's not like it's the hardest thing in the world. And once again, some of them are literally just like, you do it fast enough, you get bonus points, and it's just, you know, grading you. But something about that balance, when you're in the middle of like all this insane action, it still helps you feel like you're a part of it. And I think that was always meant to be the case, where it's like, hey, you're a part of the action. We don't want it to just be a cutscene. We want you to experience or like feel like, you know, you made this thing happen. But there were so many moments where it's like, yeah, this was pointless. Like, I could have just watched them do like one kick to the door, you know? Like, you didn't have to have me here pressing A so they kick the door 3 times, and then it's like, you know, old school 2D animation where clearly they just repeat the animation over and over again, and then on the 3rd time the animation continues. Like, you can clearly tell they just kick and then drop, kick and then drop, and then the 3rd time they kick and then drop, and then they go into a different animation. But it's like, I just saw the same animation happen 3 times in a row because I pushed the button but it had nothing to do with like completing the task. It was just, yeah, press the button 3 times and then the door opens or something like that. And I think that was the era when it was like, you're just, it was honestly padding. That's what it was. Like there were some elements where it was padding and it was like, you could have just let me do this. Like this, that was another side of it. It was either just padding where it would be like you added an extra couple seconds, which seems like nothing. And then I'm sure there are some games that did it over and over again where it's like, it feels like you added 10 minutes of gameplay just from repeating animations and forcing me to press something 3 times before it worked. And that was definitely an element for sure where it was like, do this QTE thing. And then you just have to do it when it's like, yeah, just let it open one time. Like just let it open once, because that's annoying. And then the ones that just seem insignificant where it's like, why'd you make me do that? You know, like you have me playing this when I did it one time, or it was just a pointless, motion that I had to take. And that could have been a cutscene. Like, just let this play out and then let me get to the next segment. But you made me stop and push a button 2 or 3 times. And I think we've gotten to a point where, for one, we've definitely strayed very far away from just everything that has happened in terms of QTEs as a whole. But the ones that remain, I think, have actually done a decent job. Like I said, Resident Evil does a good job. Spider-Man, I think, is the game so far, is the one that has the most QTE segments of like any franchise that's currently out there. Like they do it all over the effing place. So it's interesting to have it, and it's like they're still out there. And personally speaking, I still think because of games like Spider-Man, because of games like the RE4 remake, where it's much more minuscule, but it's still there. They have little moments. You do the button mashing. Heck, I think they had that. I think they added it in the RE3 remake where you could actually like button mash to push the zombies off you. And I think it was like you take less damage or something weird like that. But they've had it for a little minute there. And like I said, it's very small. It's little stuff like that. Like, oh, the zombies grab you. You can button mash to press them, get them off of you. Or, in Resident Evil's case, you can actually use like counter weapons. And it's like, well, you can do this. You can stab them with the knife. You can push them off. RE2 had that's where they had the counter weapons, and then RE3 had the dodge, but I don't think the button actually showed up. You just had to know what the dodge button was. So Resident Evil's still been utilizing it quite a bit in recent years, and like I said, I don't think Spider-Man's going to get rid of it. Who knows? Insomniac might even throw it into the Wolverine game, which they say is still coming out. They say they're still working on it, so that'll be nice. But that'll be interesting to see. They're still out there. QTE still exists. And for me personally, I think they still have a place in gaming. You just have to be very, very specific about it. Very specific. It has to be so over the top that it would just be a cutscene, but you put those little, it's like flair. It's just like a little bit of flair where it's like, oh, I do feel like I'm involved. But don't make it mundane. Don't make me kick a door 3 times. And then the second, you play the game the second time over and it's like, all right, now I have to do this part where I hit the door 3 times. And there are so many games that actually have that where they take all those things out, button presses, where it's like instead of it being, button mashing for QT segments, you just hold it and so you can get through it. Some games I'm sure have it where you can just straight up skip them. So there's, in terms of like the accessibility stuff, we've got a lot of options for that. Spider-Man in particular is definitely one that has those options. Like, all right, don't bother pressing it. Just hold it down, boom, you pass. So, you can do that whether it's for accessibility options of just like, maybe you got carpal tunnel or something, or you just effing hate it. You just don't care about QTEs. Just let me hold this and get through it as fast as possible. Just let it be a cutscene. So obviously everybody's different, but I do feel like they still have their place. And in all honesty, I think Spider-Man and Resident Evil, specifically 4, are the perfect examples of games that could still utilize QTEs in a particular way. Whether it's a curated sequence where it's like, this is a little too crazy to expect anyone to accurately complete during gameplay, or it's just all in-game stuff because they took out all the QTE stuff that happened during cutscenes. They took all of that stuff out of like Resident Evil 4, but they still have all of it when you have to parry things. Like I said, they took it out as far as like the boss fight goes. They don't have the scene with the boulders where they run after you in the same way, or any of the other chase sequences that they had in the original RE4. So they took all that stuff out, so it's not in cutscenes, it's all in-game. So if you get caught, you button mash, or you can use the knife and the buttons pop up, or if you're just parrying, boom, you just hit the button for the knife and you parry. So I think those 2 games really do prove like there's a space for QTEs to still be implemented in games in a way that is definitely utilized well. Like, I think for sure it's definitely utilized very well in those two games. So I think it has a place. It's a small place. Now I want to be very clear. QTEs have a small space to play when it comes to video games in this era, or going forward in all of existence. A very small place. But if someone's doing something that's real crazy, over-the-top anime stuff, and it's not just a full cutscene, because honestly, some of those sequences in Naruto, it would be like stopping gameplay for like a straight 5 minutes. Like, some of the stuff they do is so crazy, and they were just like, look, we can't do this through natural gameplay, and we don't want you just sitting there not doing anything for 5 minutes. It looks beautiful, don't get me wrong, but even they were like, yeah, we want you to be involved at least a tiny bit. So if it's excessively over the top, once again, Bayonetta is a great example. They have the QTEs, although that has way more to do with like ratings and stuff like that than it even does actually completing a task, because everything is auto-completed for Bayonetta. It's just like extra points. So that's a little bit different compared to like, hey, do you actually complete it when it's the Naruto games, or, you know, if you're going back old school, Asura's Wrath. But they still have a place where if it's over the top action, I think you can do it. Or like I said, if you're doing Heavy Rain, where it's like clearly the point of the game is every single thing is meant to be in line with, hey, you have to do a QTE and you have to be on your P's and Q's the whole game. It's like, okay, the game is built around that. I have not played Detroit Become Human. I don't think that's the case for that. I think that is more to do with the options. I played the demo and it felt like none of that stuff was in there from like the Heavy Rain days and stuff like that. But I think, like I said, I said very, but I'm going to say excessively small space. The two games that are doing it, the Spider-Man franchise and Resident Evil, is still pulling it off well. But that is about it. I'm sure someone else could come along. If they make the whole game is QTE stuff, you can do it. You make another over-the-top anime-style action game where so much stuff is happening that you couldn't possibly do it in gameplay, then yes, have those couple of crazy moments where you make the character, you know, go to the next level or get even angrier or just punch through something and like make it fit. Especially, I would highly recommend looking up Asura's Wrath, because I genuinely think it's the perfect example of a lot of QTEs, but it effing works because the game is so crazy. It's like, yeah, it fits. And like, you hit the button and then they do like punch zooms when you hit the button. They actually use those. It wasn't like a lot of games where it's like, yeah, hit the button, it shows up in the middle, you hit the button and it keeps going. They use the QTEs in that game in like the realest way that I could possibly think of. Like, they actually used them as a part of the fun, and like they emphasized, oh, you hit this button, you get a sound effect for it. It changes the camera perspective, or it zooms the camera in. It actually worked with the QTEs as a part of the game. So, in of course, a much more impactful way than Heavy Rain, but different games, but you know, sort of the same reasoning for why they needed so many QTEs. But I highly recommend looking at both those examples, just as an interesting look back on the history of QTEs in gaming. Look at both of those and like see the difference, but how they both utilize them very well because it's kind of built around it. But unless you're doing that, or it's very minimal, I don't think there's a need for QTEs in games anymore. Like, at all. There's just no need for it. So that excessively small space still exists, and every once in a while people will utilize it correctly, and I think it's actually kind of fun. So overall, I think they still have a place. It's just so tiny and microscopic. I feel like I have to really specify just how small this itty bitty little space can be, but they still have a place nonetheless. But I would love to know your thoughts. QTEs, the games that did them right, if you have any where it's like, this game just did it, and like I look back on it and I still think, yeah, those QTEs worked. Games that did it horribly, there are a lot, because they were all over the place during a certain era in gaming. Heck, I'm sure there's franchises that are still existent now where if you went back 4 or 5 games, it was like, yeah, that was during the QTE era. Like, you know, that's when they had them in all the games, so that's why that game has those QTEs. But you know, they get past that stuff. So there's tons of franchises that had it that have just like abandoned it, or at the very least figured it out, because I know Resident Evil eventually did end up abandoning it. I can't think of any from RE7 or 8 where there are QTE segments, and then once they started doing the remakes, it's like, oh, they kind of have like QTE segments. So it's interesting, you know, some could get rid of it and then bring it back, but actually, you know, make it work in a different way, and that's kind of cool. So I like that element. And also, I think it's fair to say that QTEs do have to specifically show the button, because Resident Evil technically had it in the Resident Evil remake where it's like, hey, you just hit this specific button and then you can use like your your counter weapons and stuff like that. So there are a lot of moments where you press the button and it does a thing, but an actual QTE segment has to show the button that you need to press. That's why I still count RE4, because even if you took the HUD off, obviously the button would still be there because it's technically just a parry button. But because it shows up, I'm like, it counts. It shows up every time you have the opportunity to do it. It's like, hey, L1. I mean, it shows up for like a half a second and it's like the size of a pea. It's just in the corner of my vision, and then I get hit in the face anyway. But I still count that as a QTE. If the button flashes, it tells me what to push, and I have to be quick about it. That's a QTE. So it still counts, but they still had those elements even without telling you. Because I think in RE2, they didn't show the buttons, but it was the same concept where it's like you can use your counter weapons if you want to, but I don't believe they showed the buttons. I can't remember because it's been a minute since I played the RE2 remake, but you could use it. They just didn't show the buttons, if I'm not mistaken. And like I said, it was the same with the dodge. They don't show you the dodge button. You can just choose to dodge because you know what the button is. So, same outcome, but technically not a QTE. The button doesn't pop up and like flash in your face like press this now, but still the same element. So that's just a little caveat I wanted to push, because there are a lot of games that do still have that, but it's like, I'm not gonna call every parry in every game on earth a QTE segment. That doesn't even make sense. It's definitely like a quick time moment, but can we say it's a quick time event? That's getting into like technicalities and semantics and stuff, but I do think it qualifies. It has to show the actual button on screen for it to count as a QTE. Otherwise, it's just a quick mechanic of the game. Like if you parry, it's not flashing the parry button every time you do it. So wanted to throw that out there just because I thought that was worth saying, just because it's an interesting thing. Like, when you get down to the semantics and technicalities of all those things, you can have, even like I said, with Resident Evil, it's one franchise that continues the same thing, but in one game it won't have buttons to press for it, and then in another game it will. Because I think in RE3 is when they first added the little meter where you can button press to get out of stuff faster, but I don't think they had that in the second game at all. And once again, I could be wrong because it's been forever since I played the RE2 remake, but I'm pretty sure that was something that they added in 3 and then they kept it in 4. And then they added the counter attack button as well to utilize the knife. So just an interesting thing to kind of throw out there at the end. But like I said, I definitely want to know your thoughts on QTEs, the good, the bad, the in between. What games do you feel like actually utilize them well? What games were ruined? I would love to hear that. I don't think any game for me was personally ruined, but what game do you think about where you're like, man, if they took out the QTEs, it would at least go up like 2 or 3 points. I would love to hear that, because I don't have any personally where it just took away from the game. But considering it was an entire era where we were just bombarded with QTEs, I know that there are games. I can't remember specifics, but I can remember games, like seeing reviews where it's like, and then you got a bunch of QTE segments, and then it's like you do it for this, and this, and it's annoying. So I know there are games that were affected by that, and that's why we had to get out of that realm of gaming. But I would love to know what games you guys thought were ruined by him, and what games, like I said, actually utilize QTE as well. So please put your comments down in the comment section below, and of course, thanks for watching.